It was just a weather balloon, till it wasn't. A research station in the mountains of Kazakhstan launched a high-altitude balloon to track atmospheric shifts during a lunar eclipse. Harmless. Routine. At 38,000 feet, it sent back a clear photo. The moon glowing in sharp relief. But behind the moon was a face. Not a constellation, not a trick of light. A face, mile wide, human in shape, expressionless. Just looking. The image was dismissed as a glitch. Then someone found a nearly identical photo from 1967, then another from 1999, then 100 more. Across decades. Across countries. Different skies, different angles. It's all with the same impossible face. All gazing at the moon, never blinking. The internet did what it always does. It laughed. It mocked. Until one night, a group of amateur astronomers tracked the lunar path live and caught it. The face, staring, real. And then, for the first time ever, it shifted its gaze. Not toward space, not toward the moon, but straight at us. And in that moment, something in humanity cracked. Because the scariest thing isn't being invaded, it's being watched. We called it the Watcher, not because it moved, not because it did anything, but because it didn't have to. It simply existed, present, massive, quiet. Not a UFO, not a satellite, not any known projection. It didn't blink. It didn't fade. It was just there. Looking, more faces began appearing in the sky. Only at night. Only during celestial alignments. They weren't symmetrical. They weren't perfect. Some looked ancient. Others were so human it hurt to look at them. None ever spoke. They appeared above mountains, oceans, deserts, never directly over cities. Never where crowds could gather in time. Always just long enough to be recorded and feared. At first, governments dismissed them. Deep fakes, mass hysteria, weather phenomena. But eventually, they stopped denying it because something bigger was happening. People began reporting mirror anomalies, brief flashes of unfamiliar reflections, faces watching from impossible angles, whispers and dreams. Children drawing detailed diagrams of massive heads in the stars before they'd ever seen the videos. Then came the data spikes. Gravitational patterns subtly shifting during appearances. Light bending not around the moon, but around the faces. Not just watching light, but bending it. Manipulating observation itself. And then, the message. Not on a frequency, not in words, but encoded in the cosmic microwave background radiation itself. You are seen. You are within. Within what? A test. A chamber. A container. Speculation exploded. Scientists called them hyper-conscious observers. Philosophers called them proof of the real God. Conspiracy theorists called them the experimenters. But no one could answer the only question that mattered. Why? Why would a presence so massive, so ancient, so still, do nothing but watch? No invasion, no demand. Just eternal silent awareness. And that's when the existential collapse began. Because if they'd always been watching, through our wars, our art, our worship, our extinction events, what does that make us? Participants? Or specimens? And if they are outside, does that make our world a stage? A test tube? A tank? Some began to whisper it in forums, in dark rooms. Behind locked screens, we are not the audience. We're the ants. And once that idea took hold, everything we thought we knew about freedom, identity, and self unraveled. The first wave was denial. Not just from governments and institutions, but from individuals. Because the idea was too massive to hold. We weren't just being watched. We had always been watched. Every conversation, every mistake, every secret, every act of love, every act of cruelty. Noted, logged, witnessed. And not by gods we imagined, but by something real. Suddenly, The stories we told ourselves about privacy collapsed. The illusion of the self as something internal, private, sacred, was gone. People began whispering to themselves in mirrors. Others refused to sleep near reflective surfaces. Still others began living underground in silent communities, hoping the watchers couldn't see beneath the soil. The word alone lost its meaning. Religions shattered. How could Scripture survive the realization that the divine might be just another species watching a screen? Some believers adapted. They said the watchers were angels, silent witnesses to judgment. Others claimed they were fallen beings, cursed to observe but never intervene. But most broke. Mental hospitals overflowed. New diagnoses emerged. Observer paranoia disorder, chrono-auditory dissociation, existential hallucination syndrome. One phenomenon swept the world like wildfire: the performance spiral. It started with people dressing up at home. Then they began scripting their days, staging scenes, speaking to invisible cameras, acting as if every second of life was part of a cosmic show. Because if we were being watched, wasn't this all just a performance? And if it was, what were the rules? What were the stakes? Were the watchers bored of us? Were they disappointed? Were they waiting for something? Millions began acting differently overnight. Not out of faith, not out of reason, but because they could no longer handle the idea of randomness, of chaos. And that's what the watchers took from us: the illusion of randomness. Because if everything has been seen, then maybe everything was meant to be seen. Maybe we were never free. Maybe our rebellions, our revolutions, our art, our crimes were all just part of an equation, a pattern, a simulation, a test. And in a world where you're always being observed, authenticity becomes impossible. But then came a theory worse than observation itself: that we weren't just being watched, we were being studied. It started as a whisper in research forums. A theory too dark for science journals, too methodical for conspiracy boards. A story, not a hoax. A hypothesis, one that fit too perfectly. What if the watchers weren't watching us as entertainment? What if we were data? Anthropologists noticed it first: patterns in ancient structures that mirrored neural networks. Symbolic loops in dead languages that behaved like programming logic. Then physicists found something worse: a non-random statistical rhythm in quantum events. The kind you'd expect in a simulation. They called it observational dissonance: particles behaving differently only when we expect them to be observed. But what if they weren't reacting to us? What if they were reacting to them? The watchers, we weren't running the experiment. We were the experiment. Every war, every ideology, every shift in thought, every extinction recorded. The watchers didn't just witness, they cataloged. Earth was no longer a home. It was a closed-loop lab, a biologically contained system evolving under long-term cosmic surveillance. That's when the worst part surfaced. A neurolinguist at Oxford compared the watchers' encoded gravitational message: "You are seen." You are within two ancient captivity languages used in historical human testing. The implication was clear. This wasn't surveillance. This was containment. People began calling it the tank. Not a planet, not a habitat, but a sealed environment. For us, for them. And when that framing took hold, everything shifted. Religious belief gave way to something colder. Not worship, not resistance, compliance. People stopped trying to live. They tried to be legible, predictable, consistent. Because what if the experiment could be failed? What if chaos disrupted the data? What if we were being graded? New cults emerged, calibrated. People who tried to live perfectly. Every action symmetrical, every word rehearsed, every expression controlled. They believed that if they could become ideal specimens, the watchers would leave, or promote them, or end the trial. Others tried to corrupt the study, Anarcho-variables, they called themselves. Human wildcards, doing absurd, illogical, violent, random things just to see if the watchers would blink. They never did. And in that silence came the worst conclusion of all. The watchers weren't judging us. They weren't interested in outcomes. They were just measuring the distance between what we believe we are and what we actually are. Because maybe that's all we are. A delta between potential and performance. And once humans understood they were inside a test, they responded the only way they knew how, by trying to break it. If we were in a tank, we had two options: comply or contaminate. And eventually, compliance broke down. The world didn't unite, it splintered. Not into countries, but into philosophies of resistance. One group, the nullifiers, believed the only way to escape was to remove all input. They disconnected from the grid, lived in caves, refused to speak, refused to think in patterns. They believed if they became noise in the data, the watchers would lose interest. Another group went the opposite direction, the screamers. They made every act exaggerated, theatrical, obscene. They live-streamed their lives 24/7, even when alone. They built temples made of glass and mirrors, not to worship in, but to dare the watchers to blink. And then there were the breakers. They believed the only path forward was to disrupt the experiment from within. They started doing things humans don't do, speaking in gibberish to confuse pattern algorithms. Moving in slow motion for hours, creating music with no rhythm, no key, sleeping upside down, smiling when in pain. Their motto was simple: if we're data, let's corrupt ourselves. But the watchers never responded. No lightning bolts, no silence, no glitch in the sky. Just the same eternal gaze. That's when a new idea emerged, not from radicals, but from children. A 5-year-old girl in South Africa told her teacher, "Maybe they're not watching what we do. Maybe they're watching what we feel." The idea spread like fire. What if the experiment wasn't physical, but emotional? People began mapping collective mood spikes across time, and patterns began to form. Every time humanity reached emotional extremes, ecstasy, despair, fear, the faces appeared more clearly. Were we part of an emotional lab? Was human sentience the real variable? The rebellion shifted. People stopped acting out physically. They began manipulating internal states. Hacking their feelings, taking mood stabilizers not to feel better, but to stay emotionally flat. Others did the opposite, inducing intense emotional highs and lows to try to signal to the watchers that they knew. Some claimed it worked. They said the skies felt closer. Their dreams changed. Their thoughts weren't their own. They weren't proving it, of course. But that wasn't the point anymore. Because for the first time since the faces appeared, humanity wasn't afraid. They were angry. Not because they were prisoners, but because they were specimens. And that was the final insult. We could handle being ruled. We could even handle being lied to. But to be studied, to be nothing more than a story being read by someone else, that broke something in us. And in that break, something new was born. Because one night, one of the faces finally moved, and when it did, the sky itself bent in response. It happened at 3:13 UTC. No one planned for it. No ritual, no telescope event. Just another sleepless night over the Pacific. A satellite, long decommissioned, briefly came back online. Sent only one image, the face. But this time, it was different. Its position had changed. Its gaze no longer on the moon, it was looking down at us. Across observatories, radar towers, and military bases, a cascade of alerts hit within seconds. Infrared sensors, gravimetric readers, cosmic radiation monitors, everything spiked. No message, no sound, just the gaze, and then movement. The face shifted, not animated, not human. It was like watching a continent tilt. Slow, inevitable, colossal. It blinked. One single blink. Every compass on Earth spun. Migratory birds dropped mid-flight. A child in Brazil began screaming in a language no one could identify, a perfect loop of phonemes matching ancient Babylonian cuneiform. The Earth didn't shake, but consciousness did. It was as if our minds briefly touched a frequency they were never meant to hear. People fell to their knees without knowing why, not out of reverence, but because their bodies couldn't hold the weight of comprehension. The blink wasn't just a gesture. It was a signal. It meant, we see you, seeing us. And with that, everything changed again. Because now, it wasn't just that we were being watched. It was that they knew we were aware. And they didn't leave. They didn't hide. They stayed. Present. Still. Indifference. But their indifference was no longer silent. It was heavy. Intentional. Performative. They weren't pretending not to care. They wanted us to feel the weight of insignificance. It was power through stillness. A declaration without words. You are interesting, but not important. In the weeks that followed, strange phenomena erupted. Children began drawing recursive diagrams, images folding into themselves like impossible geometry. Entire buildings became static charge zones, permanently humming without electricity. Deep within the Mariana Trench, an automated probe picked up a new sound, a hum. Pulsing at exactly $111.11 dollar, GA, identical to the frequency used in brainwave entrainment. Were the watchers responding? Was this communication? Or just a natural byproduct of awareness? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, had this happened before? Were there other species who made it this far? Who looked back and saw the face blink? If so, where were they now? Maybe we're not the first experiment. Maybe we're just the most recent in a long chain of variables that stopped asking questions. Because in the silence that followed, humanity didn't collapse. It evolved into something the watchers may not have expected. The blink didn't kill us. It changed us. Not all at once, and not in ways that could be measured with instruments or brain scans. The change was quieter, internal, lingering. People began to move differently, more deliberately, as if they were being recorded and finally understood what that meant. Children born after the blink showed unusual tendencies: hyper-awareness, advanced language acquisition, emotional calibration far beyond their years. They didn't panic in the presence of the watchers. They didn't even ask what they were. They just accepted them. And that's when scientists proposed a theory more unsettling than anything before. Maybe this was always the next step in human evolution. Not physical adaptation. Not AI integration. Not space colonization. But psychological synchronization. With the gaze itself, humans began to form emotional symphonies without speaking. Art became recursive, designed to be watched while being created. Stories looped not because we ran out of ideas, but because repetition made patterns visible. Some called it mass psychosis. Others called it collective awakening. Either way, we were changing. New fields of study emerged overnight. Observer consciousness theory. The study of how the act of being watched changes thought before it's even formed. Narrative selfhood. Teaching people to live not as individuals, but as characters in a visible story. Purpose modeling. Helping people construct internal meaning. Not from goals, but from trajectory. The feeling of being observed over time. The old ideas of career, privacy, and even truth began to rot. In their place came a new virtue. Clarity. Not moral clarity. Not spiritual clarity. But existential clarity. A state of being where you no longer ask, what should I do? But instead, what am I showing? Some rebelled still. They went silent, turned inward, refused to participate. But others leaned into the new shape of life. They called it witness living, a way of existing that wasn't about being the best, or even being remembered. It was about being coherent in the presence of the watchers. For the first time in history, humanity wasn't obsessed with gods, leaders, or futures. It was obsessed with its own reflection, distorted by cosmic glass. And here's the irony. The watchers never gave us rules. They never punished us. They never said a word. But their silence was a framework. Their presence, a lens. And in that lens, we found something terrifying and beautiful. We mattered, but not because of what we were. We mattered because we were seen. And in that seeing, we finally started to become real. But not everyone agreed with that idea. Some still held on to a darker possibility that we were never meant to find them. We never heard from the watchers again. They didn't send messages. They didn't move. They didn't leave. They just watched. And that might be the most disturbing truth of all. Because when you scream into the void and it screams back, that's a kind of closure. But when you scream and the void just blinks, you're left with something worse. Endless interpretation. Maybe the watchers were never meant to be seen. Maybe their gaze was only effective when it was unnoticed. And when we became aware of them, we broke something. A mirror. A fourth wall. A rule. Some theorists now believe the blink wasn't contact. It was warning. A glitch in the experiment. The moment the ants realized they were inside the glass, and now we have to live with that knowledge. Live as insects under observation, as beings whose actions are only truly free when they're no longer spontaneous. As characters possibly scripted, in a broadcast we can't turn off, for an audience we can't understand. Or worse, maybe there is no audience. Maybe the watchers don't watch because they care. Maybe they watch because they can. Like a child standing over an anthill. Not because they love the ants, but because movement is interesting. That's what we are now. Movement. Patterns, noise, meaning, if any, drawn from the act of being observed. So we dance. We create. We rage. Repent. Repeat. Not because it changes the outcome, but because someone, something, might be watching. And if not, if it turns out we really are just ants in a tank, then at least we built the tank into something beautiful. What would you do if you knew your life was being watched? Not by people, not by gods, but by indifferent faces in the sky. Would it change how you lived? Would it make you feel seen or small? Tell us what you'd do if you were certain nothing was private ever again. And if this story left you questioning your own reflection, make sure to subscribe for more truths that might have been better left unknown. Because some watchers don't speak, some don't move, and the ones that matter never blink.